The first thing to sag in the night was the tin chimney over the infirmary shed, as if the wind and snow had pressed down on its throat. The door of the supply office flew open in a rush, and cold poured through the crack, making the bare bulb's light tremble against the glass into a veil of pale mist. Karl Hoffman did not look up. His hand hovered over the last line of the ledger, the red pencil point suspended. And in the coal column there remained a number so thin it might as well have been a lie. Beside his elbow sat an open tin box holding that day's requisition slips. Their corners had curled with damp, like a row of flames on the verge of going out. It was mid-December 1944, and the countryside of Mercer County, Pennsylvania, had been pushed out of shape by a blizzard. Far off, roads were buried until the shoulders vanished. Railroad switches failed again and again. Regional transport broke into segments that no longer connected. The wind worked like a dull blade, scraping at the camp's plank walls, its wire mesh, its guard shacks, until everything seemed shaved down and raw. This was one corner of an American POW camp on U.S. soil, a place divided by clear zones and clear procedures. The kitchen, the infirmary, the guard posts, the warehouse, the barracks for prisoners. Each had a stove, each had pots and pipes, each had a minimum line of heat that had to be held. Coal was the only thing that could tie those lines together. Karl had once believed that lines and numbers did not betray people. Before the war, he had been a dispatcher's clerk in Germany's rail system, used to turning trains into neat squares on a timetable, used to making sure every handoff came with a signature and a receipt. Later, he was drafted into a logistics billet, keeping inventory for a unit retreating in the west, and the convoy was cut off in the chaos. Exhaustion and hunger pushed men toward the edge of surrender. He was captured by American forces, processed, numbered, moved, and shipped across the ocean to a place far from any gunfire. The number removed him from the front, but it did not lift him out of the shadow of responsibility. In any system, he knew, when something went wrong, there had to be a name that could be pointed to. A prisoner's name, most of all, was easy to use as ballast. Under supervision, the camp allowed prisoners to do permitted work inside its fences, and Karl was assigned to the supply office for clerical and scheduling duty. His desk was not far from the door. Beside it stood the logbook where every entrant wrote a time and a name. On the wall hung a process chart. Requisition, signature, verification, filing. Black arrows closing into a loop. Next to it was a priority list. The infirmary and the kitchen at the top. Then the guard posts, then everything else. When Quartermaster Sergeant Frank Daniels slid a stack of blank forms across to Karl, his movements were clean and brisk, stripped of any unnecessary feeling. He pointed out the stamp, the carbon paper, the filing cabinet, each location made plain. Karl could see it at once. Order here was not sustained by spoken assurances, but by a paper trail that could be followed. That trail was both lock and blade. It could protect, and it could pin a man to the ground. A few days earlier, Captain Margaret Stone had run a public inventory reconciliation at the warehouse door. Men had shoveled the coal pile aside, and the damp beneath it breathed out a sour smell. The weights used for the scale dropped with a dull metallic thud. She had the different sections verify stock and compare requisitions in sequence. Any adjustment had to be justified in writing and recorded on the spot. Someone tried to divert coal to the guard posts first, insisting the snowy night demanded stability. Someone else hinted the storage chain had already done its part, and the shortage should not be laid at transport or the warehouse's feet. Margaret did not raise her voice. She simply forced each dispute back onto the page and made the signature chain the only language anyone could pretend to recognize. Standing off to the side, Karl understood for the first time that transparency was not kindness. It was a tool that dragged power into the open and held it there. When the blizzard truly settled in, that tool started to bear weight. A wall of wind-driven snow blocked the rail outside the warehouse. The coal truck did not return for hours, then did not return at all. A pile that should have lasted a week was chewed down into thin slices by days of hard wind and falling temperature. The kitchen stoves had to keep hot food moving for hundreds. Infirmary's heaters had to press down the risks of frostbite and infection. The guard posts could not go entirely cold, or night patrol would turn into another kind of accident. Coal shifted from reserve to countdown. The countdown shifted from a physical problem into a question of responsibility. Everyone began looking for the safest landing, get coal into hand or get blame into someone else's. Frank set a new request on Karl's desk. The use was scribbled in a hurry, the handwriting trembling. Karl flipped to the corresponding line in the requisition log and saw the missing signature from the prior step. A chain suddenly cut. His finger paused at the edge of the paper. He did not fill the blank. Through the doorway he caught someone peering in, eyes sweeping the forms and then withdrawing as if waiting for him to make a mistake. Werner from the prisoner barracks often watched that way, as though anyone who stood closer to the American supply office deserved suspicion. At the same time, a labor detail returned from the coal yard, and the man they called Old Emil lagged at the back. Beneath his cap brim, his skin looked grey. His knuckles seemed frozen into wood. His breath crusted fine frost along his scarf. Karl understood suddenly that an empty line in a ledger was not a paper flaw. In the night, it could become a fire that went out without warning in some stove. He set the red pencil back into his palm, pulled out a fresh reconciliation sheet, and began a 48-hour fuel forecast. Every data point had to match a requisition slip. Every slip had to match a signature point, and every signature point had to trace back to a specific post and a specific time. Outside, the wind drew a long, vibrating note along the wire fence, like a train groaning in unseen snow. Karl flattened the paper and wrote his first conclusion, then his second, his handwriting steadier than it had been. He knew the next time the door flew open, it would not be only coal that came in. It would be everyone's fight over where responsibility belonged. By morning, the snow still had not stopped. Outside the camp, road signs stood half submerged in white. Karl pinned the 48-hour forecast he had calculated overnight to a clipboard. Its edges were polished by sweat and coal dust. The supply office window was thick with frost. Now and then, he heard the dull scrape of a shovel against frozen ground, like iron tapping a massive, silent stone. On the bulletin board, a fresh notice listed transport delays, the ink blurred by damp. The only legible phrases were switch failures, branch blockages, awaiting clearance, words like a string of judgments that refused to yield, crushing any hope of soon. He sorted requisition slips by use. The infirmary and kitchen went on top. The guard posts and other needs were pressed down beneath them, as if he were retying ropes and choosing which knots would hold first. Carbon paper crackled softly as he fit it into the forms. The stamp's rubber face carried a wet, icy chill. Every time it came down, it felt like keeping a stove's fire alive by force. Each slip needed 3 copies, one that went out with the coal, one that stayed in the reconciliation folder, and one that went into the cabinet. Serial number, time, use, weight, signature point, like a line of rivets hammered into the same responsibility chain. Karl knew this structure. He had seen more complicated handoffs in the rail system. He also knew that the more complex the chain, the easier it was in shortage and panic for someone to cut it quietly at a single link. His first choice was to speed up. He did not touch the priority list itself. Instead, he compressed the gaps between process nodes. He advanced the items that could complete the signature chain, tightened the time windows between warehouse issue and pickup at each point, trying to squeeze the scramble out through sheer efficiency. He grouped the day's essential deliveries into a continuous batch, scheduled identical uses in adjacent slots to reduce repeated opening and closing of the warehouse doors and to cut down on duplicate weighing. On his clipboard, he drew finer columns, marking each verification site and each responsible identity so that any temporary change would have to leave a crease of traceable evidence on paper. To keep push carts from making empty trips across snow, he even sketched a simple line map of issue order and cart routes and taped it inside the cabinet door. The lines looked like the running diagrams he once wrote for trains, except now every line ended at a room that needed heat. But wind and snow made the system behave unlike any timetable. The scale beam at the warehouse door had frozen stiff. When the weight dropped, it stuck half an inch before settling. Pulley squealed. Pushcart wheels slipped on packed snow. Weighing errors forced verification to repeat itself again and again. The coal pile's surface had crusted into a hard shell. Shovels struck it as if chopping at black ice. Shards flew and landed on sleeves, frosting over instantly. Worse, requisition slips began to arrive with gaps. Some listed only use and quantity, with no complete signature. Some bore signatures from men who did not belong in the responsibility chain. Some carried nothing but a faint smudge at the corner, as if someone wanted a page that could pull coal in and then later vanish. Karl set those slips aside. He refused to let them mix into the traceable stack. But the gaps did not bring quiet. They brought pressure faster and harder. Names and times crowded the entry log until it looked packed solid. The door opened again and again. Cold air surged in. Paper edges fluttered up like a row of anxious tongues. By afternoon, the kitchen slips finally made it through the chain, only to be forced to stop at the warehouse door. The storage side's ledger showed numbers that did not match Karl's desk, like two parallel tracks that suddenly diverged. Karl chased the serial numbers and found the same batch of coal written to two different destinations in two different books. The weight column had been rubbed and blurred. On the back of the carbon copies, a hazy shadow of ink showed someone had written where no one should have written. It was not a crude theft. It was more like a shifting under shortage pressure, a quiet relocation of coal on paper so the shortfall landed on someone else. Karl, speeding up, exposed the breach sooner and pulled the fight in faster. Coal did not burn any quicker in a stove, but it was being sliced off the responsibility chain more quickly than before. He also saw what shortage did to more than quantity. It magnified differences in quality. The bottom of the pile had soaked and clotted. The chunks heaved out of it carried more grit and finer fragments. When burned, they threw heavier ash that clumped and had to be hooked out more often to keep airflow open. On the ledger, a ton was the same weight either way. In the infirmary and kitchen, it meant the same weight did not deliver the same heat. The same fire did not boil the same volume of hot water. Karl noted the difference in the forecast's remarks column, trying to compensate in numbers for what reality was stealing. But the more he wrote, the clearer it became. When a system began using vagueness to swallow responsibility, even the most precise math would be dragged into mud. His second choice was to contract. He froze every item that lacked a complete signature chain, executed only what could prove itself on paper, and made each verification point clearer. He even changed the filing order to reverse chronological, so any review would start with the most recent entry. At the corner of his desk, he set up a tray labeled pending completion and isolated every slip missing signatures or with an unclear source, as if he were circling contamination to keep it from spreading into the whole ledger. It made him safer on paper. It made the world sharper. Stoves in certain sections began to flicker, especially on the prisoner side where wind slipped through plank seams and heat leaked like water through cracks. The kitchen's hot water supply was forced into cuts, steam thinned in the boiler room, and iron pipes threw longer, colder echoes. In the infirmary, they let the door curtains hang lower and moved beds closer together, trying to trade tightness of space for less loss of warmth. Pressure changed shape. It no longer came only from a lack of coal, it came from who would explain the lack. Transport blamed snowed-in roads and equipment failure. Storage insisted it issued only what it was told to issue. Each point held up colder nights and shorter hot water windows as evidence that it should be first. Karl was caught among these proofs and discovered that the easiest man to push into the open was not the one who had rubbed at numbers. It was the man who had arranged the papers most neatly. His handwriting was clearest. His forms looked like answers. They also looked like the framework of a scapegoat. Someone began flipping through his pinned forecast in the corridor over and over, fingertips lingering too long near a particular gap. Someone passed carbon copies from hand to hand, making the blank spaces look like hints that the blanks would eventually be filled with a name. By evening, the prisoner compound's gaze grew more direct. Werner stood at the edge of the crowd, his look drawn taut like a wire, reaching past a guard's back and landing on Karl. Karl understood he had become suspicious in two orders at once. In the American responsibility chain, he was the man who could write down the shortfall. In the prisoner's chain of survival, he was the man closest to resources and management. At the same time, the labor detail returned with finer coal crumbs than in previous days, evidence the pile had soaked and clotted worse. Old Emile lingered at the end of the line longer, his breathing gaps stretching, the skin under his cap brim pale and grey as if the wind were erasing it a little at a time. Karl realized the safety he had bought by contracting was paper safety. Real danger was shifting from the coal pile's missing weight into human bodies. And once that shift completed, the system's failure would be carried by someone weaker than he was. When night came down, the supply office bulb still gave off heat, but it did not warm the desktop. Karl flipped through the frozen requisitions again, his thumb tracing the empty signature boxes slowly, as if feeling for a crack that could not be seen. He knew the far end of the crack was not the coal pile. It was a responsibility bearer that could be pointed to. And in every hour the storm continued, that bearer moved one step closer to his name. He shoved the pending completion tray into the center of the desk, like setting an unexploded shell where everyone could see it. For the first time, a harder thought surfaced. If a shortfall was going to be filled in, it might as well be filled in under everyone's eyes, not inside a black box. On the third temperature drop of the night, the barracks boards snapped and popped as though the last moisture had been pulled from them. A night guard wrote down the temperature and wind direction on schedule, the pencil scraping dry across paper like a thin wire dragged over ice. The prisoner stoves began coughing intermittent black smoke. Damp coal burned low. Flame licked along the bottom of the firebox. Heat refused to rise. Smoke did the work first, roughening throats. Someone used an iron hook to pry slag from the grate. When the clumps hit a metal bucket, they landed with a heavy, muffled thud, a sound that carried through snow and fencing to the supply office as a reminder the gap in the ledger would not stay on the page. Before dawn, the infirmary sent over an urgent requisition. The paper was stained with moisture, the edges softened where fingers had crushed it. Ink turned ashen in the cold. Procedure required the infirmary's issue to be documented by both the duty staff and the supply verification, so any emergency drawer could later be traced to a responsible name. In ordinary times, that rule was a guardrail, preventing people from using urgent as an excuse to skip verification. Now the guardrail looked like a fence that had to be climbed. Karl stared at the chain of signature boxes and, without meaning to, lined them up in his mind like a rail handoff. If any link was missing, the whole train lost its origin and its destination. He followed Frank to the warehouse. Packed snow felt like chalk underfoot. Every step lifted a pale dusting. Ice crystals glittered along the scale beam. The weight dropped with a sharp, fine metallic ring. From the door crack, coal smell came out damp and sour, like iron soaked in cold water. A tarp half covered the pile. Its edges were frozen stiff, and lifting it was like tearing a giant sheet of paper. Beneath, the coal was mixed with grit and wet black clots. Shoveling did not raise dry dust so much as cold, damp fragments. The numbers on the scale could still be written precisely, and the verification could be made neat. But Karl knew the heat once this coal met a fire would be colder than its weight promised. Ash would build thicker, the firebox would choke faster. Keeping the same flame would take more hands. They loaded the coal into pushcarts. Wheels slipped on hard snow. Axles groaned dryly. The path to the infirmary shed had been carved and recut by wind-blown ridges, and every few yards the cart had to stop and find its footing again. Karl noticed how escort and handoff time stretched. The longer the time, the easier it became for another point to cut in line or intercept an issue. He also noticed that the weight written on the requisition needed more frequent micro-adjustment against the actual load because chunks varied in size and dampness, and the scale beam's rebound was sluggish in the ice. The procedure itself had not collapsed. What collapsed were the stable conditions that allowed procedure to mean anything. Shortage and falling temperature stripped those conditions away, one by one. Changes in the kitchen were more immediate. Steam over the big pots thinned. When a lid lifted, the white plume had no force, pressed back down by the cold. In the boiler room, sections of iron pipe went cool. Hot water flow slowed, and temperature dropped faster, forcing shorter windows for washing and sterilizing. Pots and tools stacked up, waiting. Metal surfaces turned blue with cold. The kitchen's requisitions ran through the chain, but in the remarks box someone had hastily added new figures. The number of meals to be served that day, the minimum stove time, the cut-off periods that would follow if fuel was reduced again. Karl copied those figures into his forecast, not to log complaints, but to bring consequence into the realm of calculation, so not enough coal stopped being an abstraction and became a valve that would close at a specific hour, cutting off hot food and hot water. In the prisoner barracks, the consequences were quieter. To save fuel, men dragged bunks toward the stove. Too close meant burns, too far meant shivering. And the room itself became a crooked form of allocation. Someone hung wet clothing near the fire, hoping to dry it on residual heat. And the damp only made the interior colder. Beads of moisture formed in the board seams, then froze at night into a thin glaze. Old Emil was placed nearer the stove, and still he could not stop trembling. His fingers dug shallow marks along the edge of a blanket, as if he were gripping the smallest possible thread of warmth. When a guard passed, his steps were quicker than usual. Breath frosted on his scarf. Leather on his sling hardened in the low temperature. Buckles did not want to move. Watching these details, Karl felt a crack open in the place he had kept hard and cold for a long time. System collapse would not land only on the opposing side. It would land first on those who were weakest, slowest, least entitled to scramble. Werner's pressure tightened into a kind of cordon. Some prisoners began deliberately avoiding the direction of the supply office, as if skirting a point that carried trouble. Others watched Karl's clipboard in the requisition queue, eyes stopping on the signature boxes as if measuring his distance from power. The camp's internal order depended on lines, work points, and guard oversight. Anyone seen as closer to management could be branded a disruption. In the logistics chain, anyone holding the ledger was, by definition, a man who could be held responsible. Karl stood in the seam between two orders and felt, for the first time, that self-protection was not the same thing as safety. The more tightly he locked responsibility into his own paperwork, the easier it became for others to shove the gap into that paperwork and walk away. That afternoon, Margaret checked the latest inventory and the delay notices in the administration corridor. The priority list on the wall had been tacked up again with heavier pins, as if the blizzard might rip it down. The clearance progress in the notices was updated line by line. Roads ploughed, switches repaired, coal cars assembled, and waiting for release. The phrases pulled the idea of restored supply slowly toward reality. Karl understood that once the first coal cars truly arrived, the scramble would jump from paper to the floor. Whoever got coal first could restart a stove first. Whoever could write a requisition into an exception could leave the responsibility to someone else. Back in the supply office, he hauled out the chalkboard used to label warehouse batches and leaned it against the wall, then found a larger whiteboard. Its edges were worn. It had once served training or announcements. Now he scrubbed it again and again with a rag until it shone. Coal dust and alcohol mixing into a brief, sharp smell. He split inventory by usable quality, dry coal, damp coal, fines, each tied to a different burn efficiency and ash load. Then he wrote each point's minimum demand line by the hour as hard numbers. The infirmary and kitchen lines he wrote heavier. The prisoner barracks minimum heating line came next. Guard posts and other uses sank lower on the board. Beside every line he left blanks for issued amount, verified weight, signer, timestamp. Spaces that would force anyone who took coal to leave a mark on the same surface. He arranged the entry log, the requisition folders, the stamp used for verification, and the filing receipts into a straight run, making the path impossible to skip. Enter and sign in, submit the requisition, weigh and verify on site, sign and record, take a receipt, file the copy. Before, the steps were scattered over desk and cabinets, easily shaken apart by confusion and hurried urging. Now he laid them out as a corridor a body had to walk through, turning procedure from a wall diagram into a visible route on the ground. He offered no explanation because explanations could be taken as a stance. He simply put the facts and the paperwork into the open, ready to make anyone demanding an exception face the public blanks and the public signature boxes first. By evening the wind eased a little. From far off came a low horn, too uncertain to name as train or clearance equipment, but clear enough to signal that transport was being stitched back together. Karl set the whiteboard where it could be seen from the door and checked the placement and order of every blank space, making sure any last-minute requisition could only be added on the board and not hidden in a drawer. Outside, the sky looked like lead thinned by snow, dim, steady. In that steadiness, he made his decision. If a shortfall was going to be filled, it would be filled in the open, not inside a black box. The horn sounded closer in the dark, and then came the dull roll of wheels over snow packed hard as stone, as if someone had dragged a heavy chain back into the camp. Word of clearance travelled first from the administration building, then along the fence line and the guard shacks, faster than the wind. A crowd formed at the warehouse door. The snow under boots turned to grey-black slush. Breath boiled in the light. Every gaze fixed on the few coal cars, the way eyes fix on a pulse that might keep a body going. The first delivery was not large, and the load was uneven. The top layer was drier. The bottom was damp and clumped, needing more force to pry apart during unloading. Forks and shovels scraped through the pile with a harsh, grating sound. Coal dust burst up and settled again like black snow. Karl stood at the supply office door. The whiteboard was already in place. Its rows of blanks opened like lines awaiting judgment. The entry log lay turned to a fresh page. The stamp and the scale weights sat on the same straight run. Anyone who wanted to bypass them would have to step around the line itself. The struggle appeared almost immediately in the language of procedure. Someone hurried forward with a requisition already signed, footsteps quick as if afraid the ink might not be dry. Someone else offered only a scrap with use and quantity, hoping a low, urgent murmur could buy a passage without record. Another tried to push a cart toward the guard posts first, letting wheels start moving before paperwork followed. In the snow-lit night, each small motion was a probe, testing whether procedure was still procedure, or whether it had become a decoration that could be flattened. Karl forced every probe back onto the whiteboard. He gave no speeches. He required the requisition to pass through the entry log, then go to the scale for verified weight, then return to the board for timestamp and signature point, and only then could a receipt be taken and coal moved. When the verification weight dropped, the metal sound rang sharper in the cold, as if nailing each issue's weight into the air. Carts had to pause beside the board. People had to write names in full, write uses in full, write quantities in full, with others watching. Ink dried slowly in the cold, like a promise made under coercion. Margaret arrived quickly at the warehouse door. Her gloves carried the metallic cold of file drawers, but she stood deliberately a little back from the pile so her eyes could cover both the board and the crowd. She compared the priority list to the minimum demand lines written on the board and confirmed that the infirmary and kitchen numbers were filled first before anything else was allowed into the queue. Temporary adjustments were not forbidden outright, but every adjustment had to be explained on the board and carry an added signature point, so an exception became a public exception instead of a current in a black box. Frank locked his attention on the verification points. Weighing errors were corrected on the spot. Carbon pages were stapled into folders immediately. The filing cabinet drawers opened and closed again and again, the metal rails sluggish in low temperature, but maintaining a steady rhythm. The real conflict came when coal was still not enough to cover every demand. Lower priority uses were squeezed. Some guard shacks would have to burn at the minimum. Some storage tasks would have to wait. The prisoner barracks could be held at the lowest line of heat, but not at anything like comfort. In the queue, someone grew restless, kicking at snow, trying to press closer and steal an earlier place. Someone else clenched his requisition like a rope he refused to let go. Karl did not inflate anyone's numbers. He only made the lines on the board clearer and wrote the time nodes in the corner. What would happen, and in what order, if the next delivery did not arrive? Once consequence was made visible, the struggle was forced to change shape. Scramble became argument. Argument became waiting that no one could pretend to misunderstand. That night, the infirmary chimney began breathing steadier grey smoke again. Steam in the kitchen thickened. When a lid lifted, the white plume had weight and force. The echo inside the hot water pipes no longer sounded like an empty iron cavity. The flow returned to a continuous line. In the prisoner barracks, the firebox could finally hold through the coldest stretch. Emil's trembling eased. The fingers that had been gripping the blanket edge relaxed a fraction, as if backing away half a step from a brink. Under the supply office light, Karl's hands were stained with ink and coal dust. But on the whiteboard, an order appeared that could be followed. Every row had an origin, a destination, a signature, a time. Yet the order did not deliver the safety Karl had imagined. The next day, Looks in the prisoner compound grew colder. Werner did not need to do anything. He only had to let his gaze rest in the direction of the whiteboard, and many would decide Karl had stepped to the other side. For certain American middlemen, the board was also uncomfortable. Public blanks meant they could no longer hide a shortfall behind vague slips. Karl had thought transparency would at least buy him a breath by sealing off blame shifting. Instead, he found transparency stripped cover from everyone, including him. The cleaner the ledger, the more he resembled a man holding a light to darkness. And light-bearers were rarely liked. In the reconciliations that followed, Margaret fixed the whiteboard practice into standard procedure. He posted clearer process sheets and required every issue to go through the same path. Filing had to be double verified. Any temporary exception had to include written explanation and an added signature point. She did not treat it as a private triumph. She treated it as a structure the camp needed to survive. Frank kept Karl's authority locked inside an auditable frame, with keys and stamps separated so no one could turn the process into personal favor. Karl gained no privilege and received no pardon. He was returned to the outline of a job. Outside that outline, judgment stayed sharp. A few days later, the blizzard began to loosen. Clearance and transport resumed more smoothly. The interval between coal arrivals shortened. The warehouse pile rose again. People began to grow used to the temperature of hot water, the thickness of steam over pots, the way a stove could last the night without constant hooking of slag. As crisis receded, many faces that had been urgent turned calm, as if those nights of cold were only weather and not a trial that had nearly torn the responsibility chain apart. Karl still sat at the same desk each day, opened the same entry log, stapled carbon pages in the same order. The sound of the stamp, once heavy, became regular, like a beat that could be predicted again. He no longer staked his value on watching the system collapse. He no longer staked his dignity on holding the hardest line. The whiteboard's blanks were filled and wiped clean day after day, leaving faint traces of ink and coal-smudged erasure, layers of evidence that in the hours when power was locked by rules, the weakest did not have to survive a bitter night on luck alone. Karl understood he was still only part of a number, but he also understood that as long as the chain could be verified, a number did not have to become a substitute for someone's convenient sacrifice.